Welcome back to another week of Design Over Time. This is a daily video game design show in which we talk about various topics that come about in my everyday life. Today I just wanted to talk about space, and I want to keep it simple. I just want to do a light overview of the topic, and I don't want to take 15, 30, 40 minutes to explain this really interesting but basic thing, right? So I want to talk about space, and I got bullet points right here, so we're going to stick to the script and try to keep this one short, I promise. So I got four main discussion points. I got four main arguments for what space is and how it works with video games. And here is point number one. Interactive space is used by nearly all video games. And this is something that you kind of have to, stop and think about, but you may have been under the assumption that all games use space. Well, not every single game does use space. We just had a really interesting video the other week about Rhythm Heaven, and Rhythm Heaven is a music action game that doesn't really use virtual space. It just has a timing challenge, and you hit the button to the time, and that's how just about every single micro game works in that game. So not every game needs space, but it's no surprise that 99%, I'm guessing, 99% of all video games use some kind of space, whether that's one-dimensional, two-dimensional, three-dimensional, or whatever. So as a quick side note, there's a difference between how a game looks, as far as its graphics go, and how its interactive space is designed. But I wrote a blog post on that a long time ago. Let me show you. Yeah, February 22nd, 2009. I wrote this article. There we go. I can never do this right. I wrote this article called 2D plus 2D equals 3D. And this article series goes over so many different examples about how games use various kinds of space and how they combine space and what that means for its gameplay and all these different pros and cons. I'll be sure to link that in the description, but we're going to move on. So the second thing I wanted to talk to you guys about, the second thing I wanted to say is that space itself, just space, is a gameplay dynamic. Space alone is a dynamic element that you introduce into your gameplay system. But let me show you the wheel. When we're talking about space, we're really talking about gameplay dynamics. And there's time. We went over time with the Rhythm Heaven video, but space is the other big, most commonly used gameplay dynamic. And it says in the future this text will be a description for space, and you can click on it to get more information. Wow, I didn't even put a definition there, but that's why we're making this video. No big deal, moving on. Just introducing space into your game pretty much gives it a certain dynamic quality. It doesn't make your game great, certainly. It doesn't make your game polished, or it doesn't improve your feedback. It doesn't really do much in particular for other high-level elements of your game, graphics, style, story, sound, any of that. But just introducing this one rule gives you a really rich foundation in which to build just about anything else you want to do in your game space, with your gameplay. Oh, and the reason why space is so dynamic is because it defines elements in a way that connects them through relative positioning. So it's not just that you can give any element in your game an X and Y position or an XYZ position if it's a 3D game. It's because when you give an element a coordinate, it relates it to all other spatial elements within your game, like automatically, right? So anytime any one element moves, all of those relative positionings change because everything is all within one, spatial ecosystem, one defined coordinate system. The third point I want to make is that space can be defined discretely with lanes or grids or something that's really easy to count, really easy to see, or you can define space continuously. And, most games, whenever you're thinking of a 2D platformer, whenever you're thinking of a 3D action game or just about any other kind of game, moving pixels at a time is what we consider to be continuous space. Whenever you're thinking of chess or Advance Wars or Fire Emblem, you're really dealing with grids, right? Everything's defined by how many squares up, down, left, right you can move. And there are other games that have lanes, right? Little Big Planet, for example, is a platformer in which you can move up and down the Z-axis by shifting lanes. Sonic does things with grind rails, and other games, pretty much limit your ability to move to very discrete areas. But I got a whole bunch of examples of games that do different things like that in the article series, 2D plus 2D equals 3D, so you can check that out later. It's pretty cool, but I'm pretty sure you can come up with some examples on your own, so we're just going to move on. Now, before we get to the final point number 4, I just wanted to go over a few pros that, adding why you should add space into your game and, what benefits you get from it. I really couldn't think of many, cons for putting some kind of spatial element inside of your game. So here are the pros. It's really neat that when you create a game defined by space, that we can represent these spaces directly and visually on TV screens. So that's really helpful for 2D games. We got 2D viewing screens or monitors or whatever. We can pretty much view the game space in the same way that it's presented. It's a little trickier with 3D games, objects being in front of other objects and camera and all those other sort of feedback issues that come when you're making a 3D game. But for the most part, representing space visually is a big plus. And, the word video in video games is there for a reason. And picking design elements that play to those strengths is a really cool thing. It's a really good thing to do. So here's another pro of why you should put space in your game. Space can hold and display lots of data points. So, we typically don't think of an element on the screen as a point of data, right? Something to learn, something to memorize, something to calculate. But it is. And whether you're playing a shoot 'em up or you're playing a platformer or a MOBA or a fighting game or whatever, right? Seeing all those bullets in a shoot 'em up you're doing a calculation. You're anticipating their movement. You're anticipating the time, all the spaces you can go with your character, and then what that means for the gameplay. Here's a third pro of using space. Kind of like what I was saying, space is very intuitive to us. We typically don't give it a second thought, but, our entire real world is spatially oriented. Having a home, walking to some place, going to work, having stuff on your desk, all this is very spatially defined, right? So we're used to things taking up their own space and interacting with things by having to go through space and connect and touch things or whatever. So, we're used to it, and it's a good thing to keep using design elements that play to our strengths, right? And the fourth pro of space that I want to talk about is that unlike any other gameplay dynamic that you might create, there is not a more powerful gameplay dynamic than space. And that kind of goes without saying. When 99% of games use space, you're looking at something that has a lot of benefits. But in terms of, people could use it and could put space into their games because it's intuitive, and that's definitely something they could do. But I think when you're just strictly talking about how dynamic space is and how it creates sort of emergent gameplay possibilities, how so many different game states can emerge from a given situation, and how one small change in that situation can create so many other game states, space is what you want to use. It's the most powerful, elegant, and intuitive option, and that's why I think so many games use it. So the fourth and final thing that I want to say, besides those pros, the final idea that I want to leave you with is that the reason why space is so powerful is because it creates a natural asymmetry when defining and moving elements in space. And this is something that I'm going to explore later. It's something that I definitely don't have all the details straight to put into this video. So when you're just reflecting on how powerful space is and what it does for a gameplay experience, I think you need to look no further to puzzle games, because so many puzzle games like Sokoban and other things that you can find on the internet, or just about, even really simple puzzle games to really complex puzzle games, they all use space. And puzzle games are a genre in general that work really well with so few complexities, and they work so elegantly within that sort of limitation. And it seems that with just a few rules, you can take something that's just non-interactive, non-interesting, right? Just like space and maybe a couple of other elements, and then you can turn it into sort of a rich and challenging puzzle game experience. And I think puzzle games do that more so than other genres. If we want our games to be deep and dynamic, I think 99% of the time you want to use space, just like everybody else is, 1D, 2D, 3D. Pick your favorite kind. Pick the one that works for your systems. But I feel like games have to be so much more complex to get a similar level of dynamic gameplay when they don't use space. So, you can look at a lot of JRPG systems and you say, hey, why does the system fall flat? Why does it get boring after 5 battles? Why, despite having all these stats and EXP and items and characters, that it feels like there's not much going on here? Well, there's a lot of ways to address that question, but at the core of it is maybe because it's probably because the gameplay system isn't dynamic enough. And I feel like for JRPGs that do the strict turn-based style, they have to add all these complexities just to try to make the game rich and dynamic in a way that is so easily obtained when you use space. So, you have to be really careful by not choosing space. And Pokemon did it, right? Pokemon having, I feel, the best RPG battle system. I mean, it spawned a whole competitive scene and movement with multiple styles. But I do find it interesting that the 6v6, single competitive battling format style of Pokemon doesn't use space, and it has all those complexities in order to make that gameplay interesting. But the doubles format for the VGC style 2v2 Pokemon battles, that battle system does have space. Each Pokemon has a left and right position, and then the opponent's Pokemon has a left and right position, and you can target specific slots, including your ally slot. Some attacks hit all the slots, some attacks only hit the two opponents, so on and so forth. So, it's really interesting how, depending on the battle mode that you pick or you're talking about with Pokemon, that space becomes a factor when it wasn't before. And there's a lot of interesting things you can compare about those two battling formats. But for now, we're just going to move on. That's another video for another day. Never forget, space is a big deal. It's very intuitive. It's dynamic. It's pretty ubiquitous when it comes to games. But understanding just how games use space to a great effect or undermine its power is something that we are seriously going to look at very closely as we move forward with design over time. So, I'll leave you some articles down in the descriptions. You can leave me your questions and comments. But yeah, my name is Richard Terrell. I go by Kirby Kid on Twitter. That's at Kirby Kid. But you should follow this YouTube channel and subscribe down below, or our Twitter at Design Oriented. But that has been this episode of Design Over Time. We will see you next time. Peace.